Have you ever looked at a piece of work you've done, a project, a painting, a business plan, and felt a cold shiver because it wasn't quite there yet? You tell yourself you're a perfectionist. You tell yourself that you have high standards. You tell people you'd rather do nothing than do something average. But let's be honest, perfectionism isn't about quality. It's about protection. It's a suit of armor you wear so no one can ever tell you that you aren't good enough. Because if you never finish, you can never be judged. This is the story of Kalen, a man who waited so long for the perfect moment and the perfect result that the world eventually forgot he existed. If you've ever been afraid to hit send or publish because it wasn't perfect, this story is for you. But to Kalen, they were merely failures in progress. He was currently staring at a design for a sustainable housing complex that was, by any objective standard, revolutionary. It was 99% complete. The structure was sound, the aesthetics were breathtaking, and the utility was unmatched. But Kalen was focused on a single, infinitesimal shadow cast by a structural beam during the Kalen studio was a graveyard of masterpieces. On his monitors sat three-dimensional renders of architectural marvels that could have redefined the city skyline. Ter Solstice, a shadow that felt a fraction too heavy for his liking. He spent 14 hours re-rendering the scene, his eyes bloodshot and his coffee cold. To Kalen, this wasn't obsession. It was integrity. He looked at the world through a lens of high-definition disdain, watching his peers churn out work like fast food. He saw his former classmate, Marcus, release a residential project that Kalen considered an eyesore, a boxy, functional, average building that was already breaking ground in the downtown core. Kalen had sneered when he saw the announcement, muttering to his empty room about the death of craft and the triumph of the mediocre. He felt a bitter sense of superiority, believing that his refusal to settle made him the true artist in a room full of sellouts. But this superiority was a lonely throne. Kalen's bank account was a desert, and his reputation was non-existent. He lived in the 99% curse, a psychological loop where the final 1% of a project took more time and soul than the previous 99 combined. He was a man who had built a magnificent cathedral in his mind, but refused to lay the final stone because he feared the mortar wasn't the exact shade of ivory he had envisioned. He told himself that he was protecting his brand, his standard, but the truth was that he had no brand. He only had a hard drive full of ghosts. Every time he neared the finish line, a fresh wave of improvements would strike him, dragging him back into the abyss of polishing. He would zoom in 800% on a digital canvas, fixing pixels that no human eye would ever perceive, convinced that the world would somehow know if he didn't. He prided himself on his perfectionism, wearing the label like a badge of honor. He didn't realize that a masterpiece that is never seen is just a high-resolution secret. He was a ghost haunting his own potential, a man so dedicated to the idea of excellence that he had become completely useless to the reality of progress. While Marcus's average building rose toward the sky, Kalen's perfection remained buried in the dark, a pristine diamond hidden in a chest that he was too afraid to unlock. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, broadcasted through a sleek promotional video for the city's new landmark waterfront project. Kalen sat in the dim glow of his studio, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, mid-adjustment of a texture that only he could see was flawed. The screen displayed Marcus, his old rival, standing on a construction site with a hard hat tilted slightly askew. Behind him, the boxy residential complex Kalen had mocked was no longer a render. It was a physical reality of glass and steel, swarming with families moving in and children playing in the plaza. Marcus was being hailed as a visionary, not because his work was flawless, but because it was there. The local news anchor praised the building's honest utility and vibrant community impact. Kalen felt a hot surge of bile rise in his throat. He opened his own files, pulling up his waterfront proposal, a design that made Marcus's look like a child's block set. Kalen's towers were ethereal, organic shapes that mimicked the flow of the tides, optimized for wind resistance and thermal efficiency down to the molecular level. It was a work of genius, and it was utterly invisible. The mirror of mediocrity didn't reflect Marcus's lack of talent. It reflected Kalen's cowardice. He watched Marcus give an interview, admitting that they had to change the facade material last minute due to budget constraints, pointing out a slightly mismatched seam on the western wing with a shrug and a smile. "It's not perfect," Marcus told the reporter, "but it's housing 300 families who didn't have a home last year." Those words struck Kalen harder than any insult. He looked at his own screen, at the perfect tide flow towers he had been tweaking for 18 months. His design had 0 seams, 0 flaws, and 0 inhabitants. The realization was a cold, sharp blade. Marcus had embraced the good enough to achieve the great, while Kalen had demanded the perfect and achieved nothing. He saw his rival's success as a mockery of his own standards, but deep down, a terrifying truth began to take shape. The world didn't care about his hidden excellence. The world rewarded the man who was brave enough to be judged, flawed and all. Kalen was a ghost in a museum of unreleased dreams, while the mediocre man was out in the sun, building the future. He looked at his rendering. The lighting was now impeccable, the shadows were mathematically balanced, and it felt like a tombstone. He was the master of a digital void, surpassed by a man who was willing to let the world see his scars. The obsession with the final 1% had always felt like a pursuit of beauty, but in the silence following Marcus's success, it began to feel like a crime. Kalen sat motionless, the cursor blinking on his screen like a steady, accusing heartbeat. He had spent 3 weeks adjusting the refractive index of the glass in his virtual lobby, convinced that the project couldn't be shown until the light hit the floor tiles with absolute, celestial precision. But as he stared at the digital perfection, he finally saw the cost of the last 1% for what it truly was, a ransom payment to his own ego. He realized that the time he spent in this final, agonizing stage wasn't about quality control. It was a stalling tactic. As long as the project was almost ready, it was safe. As long as it stayed on his hard drive, it remained a masterpiece of infinite potential, immune to the harsh light of reality and the sting of public critique. To finish was to be judged. To finish was to admit that he, too, was a human being capable of error. The perfectionism he had worn as armor was actually a blindfold, preventing him from seeing that his high standards had become a sophisticated form of cowardice. He looked at his hands, cramped from thousands of hours of clicking through menus to fix flaws that no one else would ever see. He had traded his youth, his social life, and his financial stability for the comfort of a hidden excellence. He was paying for his integrity with the currency of his existence, and the exchange rate was bankrupting him. The last 1% didn't represent the difference between good and great. It represented the wall between safety and vulnerability. By demanding a result that was beyond reproach, he had ensured he would never have to be reproached. He was the most talented man in the city, but because he was unwilling to be seen as anything less than a god of design, he had become a ghost. The weight of the realization was suffocating. Kalen understood now that the perfect render was a lie he told himself so he wouldn't have to face the terrifying possibility of being merely excellent. He was a prisoner of his own vanity, trapped in a loop of endless refinement because he was too fragile to handle a single mismatched seam in the eyes of the world. He had built a fortress of perfection, only to find that he was the only inhabitant, starving to death behind walls of his own making. The cost of the last 1% wasn't just time. It was the life he had failed to live while he was busy polishing the bars of his cage. The survival of the studio came down to a single, brutal ultimatum. Submit a proposal for the urban renewal contract by midnight or face immediate eviction. Kalen's bank account had finally flatlined, the cost of his integrity manifesting as a final notice taped to his door. He looked at his latest project, a community hub intended to breathe life into the city's industrial heart. It was a mess. By his standards, it was a skeletal, mangled disaster. The lighting was raw, the landscape textures were placeholder gray, and he hadn't even begun to calculate the acoustic vibrations of the central atrium. It was ugly. It was unfinished. It was 60% of a dream. The old Kalen would have let the deadline pass, preferring the nobility of a silent failure over the humiliation of a flawed public appearance. But as the clock ticked toward 11, the cold reality of the street outweighed the warm comfort of his ego. With trembling hands, he began to compile the files. Each click felt like a self-inflicted wound. He felt a physical nausea as he hit export on renders that he considered amateurish. He was convinced that the selection committee would laugh him out of the room, that his reputation, the one he had worked so hard to protect by doing nothing, would be incinerated in an instant. He didn't have time to fix the heavy shadows or the slightly misaligned window frames. He didn't have time to hide. He was forced into the ugly launch, stripped of his armor and pushed onto the stage in his underwear. As the progress bar crawled toward completion, Kalen felt a terrifying sense of exposure. This was the moment he had avoided for a decade. The moment where Kalen the genius became Kalen the human. He wasn't submitting a masterpiece. He was submitting a struggle. He was showing the world his mismatched seams. With 3 minutes to spare, he attached the file to the portal. His finger hovered over the submit button, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized that this single click was the most courageous thing he had ever done. It was a surrender. He was letting go of the perfect Kalen to save the real Kalen. He hit the button. The sent notification appeared, and for a moment, the world didn't end. The walls didn't crumble, and no one burst through the door to mock his placeholder textures. There was only silence. He sat back, sweating and exhausted, staring at the empty export queue. He had just released work that he hated, work that was incomplete, work that was fundamentally flawed. And yet, for the first time in years, he could breathe. The 99% curse had been broken, not by a stroke of brilliance, but by the desperate necessity of survival. He had launched his work into the void, and while he felt small and exposed, he also felt something he hadn't felt since he was a student. He felt alive. He was no longer a ghost haunting a hard drive. He was a contender in the arena, waiting for the world to tell him if his ugly truth was enough. The call from the selection committee came 48 hours later. Kalen picked up the phone with the resignation of a man awaiting a sentence, but the voice on the other end wasn't mocking. It was energized. They didn't mention the placeholder textures or the raw, unpolished lighting. Instead, the head of the committee spoke about the soul of the design. They praised the way the skeletal structure prioritized human movement over architectural vanity, and how the raw aesthetic felt honest, accessible, and urgently needed. They didn't see a disaster. They saw a heartbeat. Kalen won the contract, not because he was perfect, but because his incomplete work offered a solution to a real-world problem that a polished render never could. He stood on the balcony of his studio, looking out at the city, and realized that the world had never been looking for a god. It had been looking for a builder. People didn't need the celestial precision of his light refraction calculations. They needed a space where they could breathe, work, and exist. The flaws he had spent a decade hiding were the very things that made his work feel human. He began to see the beauty of the scar. In the months that followed, as the community hub moved from digital file to physical foundation, Kalen embraced a new philosophy, the 80% rule. He learned that the first 80% of the work provided the impact, the utility, and the vision, while the final 20%, the part he used to obsess over, was often just vanity masquerading as virtue. He started releasing work that was good enough to be useful, and to his shock, his reputation didn't crumble. It exploded. People flocked to him because his work was now frequent, functional, and filled with the grit of reality. He eventually met Marcus for drinks at the waterfront plaza. As they sat near the mismatched scene Kalen had once despised, he realized he didn't feel superior anymore. He felt a deep, quiet respect. Marcus had been right all along. A flawed building is infinitely more beautiful than a perfect thought. Kalen looked at his own hands, no longer cramped by the pursuit of the impossible, and felt a profound sense of peace. He had traded his polished prison for a messy, vibrant, and impactful life. He realized that perfection is a destination that doesn't exist, a mirage that keeps you wandering in the desert until you die of thirst. True mastery was the ability to deliver, to be seen, and to let the world interact with your rough edges. Kalen was no longer the man of the 99% curse. He was a man who understood that a scar is just a sign that something has lived, and that an impact, no matter how flawed, is the only thing that leaves a mark on the world. He closed his old files, the ones he had spent years tweaking, and deleted them. He didn't need the ghosts of perfection anymore. He had work to do, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care if it was ready. He only cared that it was real.